But I would like to at least begin to get at what I saw as Jesus the Christ presented as a white supremacist. Okay?
I draw on two presentations of Jesus by white Christian leadership to not only their people but especially slaves. That is, as Jesus as a vile white supremacist and Jesus as sovereign Lord. Those are two typologies of how Jesus had been presented, particularly as we move into the mid-18th and up into the 19th century. We start seeing the proliferation of white images of Jesus.
Good evening, and welcome to What's Up With That, a podcast with your host, Don Brington. That's me. I want to welcome you to the podcast. The What's Up With That podcast offers conversations on spirituality, personal growth, and success. The podcast delves into thought-provoking conversations and insights from experts in their respective fields, offering listeners a diverse range of perspectives and practical advice on achieving personal and spiritual growth. Welcome to the podcast, and won't you join me this evening with our guest, the Reverend Dr. Harry Singleton. How you doing, my brother?
I'm good, my brother. Very good. Glad to be on this podcast with you tonight.
Glad that you are here. And if you follow us, the Dr. Singleton, and I'm going to say Hank, Hank has a familiar face. And that's because Hank was with us in our last season. He shared with us and he shared with us on liberation theology. And tonight, we're going to come back and talk about that. Brought him back, I don't know if it's sooner than expected. I knew I was going to get him back. However, I read his book. If you were here, I held up 3 or 4 books that he had written and said that I was going to read it. I did read one, and I have it open because I'm going to be talking to the brother from this book. I read his book, White Religion and Black Humanity. And when reading it, it really caught my attention. And I called him, I think once I finished the book, I called him and shared with him that I had read it, just so that he'd know I didn't just buy the book and let it collect dust, but that I actually did read at least one of them anyhow. And then had a little bit of conversation about the book, and so invited him on the podcast to return. Liberation theology has relevance for us today. And I think maybe what we also need, we spoke in very general terms in our last visit with Dr. Singleton. So as we view his book, I think we can get down to a few more specifics and ask questions. I will say up front tonight, we're going to regulate this. We're going to try to keep it to 1 hour. I think our longest is about an hour and 40. Typically, we go over an hour, but tonight, we're going to try to hold it to that hour. And so again, welcome, Hank. And you know what? Since we met last time, some interesting things have happened in your world. How about sharing that with us?
Well, since our last interview, which was, I think, late January, early February, when I was there to be the lecturer at Houston Tennessee College.
University, man, university.
Excuse me?
University. Get it right. Get it right.
Get it right. So, On June 2nd, I was named the Lilly Director of Faith-Based Education and Engagement at the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. A museum that's in its initial stages of development. It's been a project that's 10, 15 years. It's been in the making. But it's a museum that's been open 2 years. We just celebrated our 2-year anniversary on June 27th.
Okay.
And so, my job as faith-based Director of Education Engagement is to do just that. It is to educate the public relative to African diasporic faith, particularly the liberating dimensions of African diasporic faith, to contribute to curatorial offerings in the museum, and of course to use the museum as a place not just of historic remembrance, but also as a place of contemporary dialogue. And so we are involved with a number of local faith communities and leaders, as well as national leaders, from a partnership standpoint, not only with the museum itself, but in programming, so that we might have a bigger impact beyond the museum. As we call ourselves a First Voices Museum, we like to have the voices of those who've gone before us speak to us in our programming, as well as in our curatorial presentation at the museum itself. And so this is a Lilly-backed position. Lilly has been very generous to the museum in terms of its core mission to want to perpetuate this discourse on African American and African diasporic dialogue relative to faith perspectives that promote a healthy self-image, a healthy Black self-image, and of course, cornerstone with the liberation motif. And so I'm happy to be there. I'm still teaching, as I spent over 20 years in academia. I'm just teaching in a different venue now. And so pedagogy is still first and foremost, front row and center. I'm just doing it in a different way than looking forward to the challenges and the joys that lay ahead.
Okay, I was wondering, I had not asked that question, but I was wondering if you had completely left the classroom. And so you've left the university, but you're engaging in that educational process, and you continue the academia aspects of it within the confines of the museum. Is that it?
Yes.
Okay.
I haven't completely left academia. There are some teaching opportunities there that I may pursue coming up in the fall. But my primary allegiance right now and my attention lie with the International African American Museum.
Okay, that's awesome. That's awesome. You all had a wonderful panel presentation about a week or so ago. I was scrolling Facebook and I said, wow, this looks pretty good. So you that's part of the panel, of the discussions and other kinds of things that you have also at the museum under your purview?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We have 6 signature programs that we put on each year. Of course, my primary objective in this position is to build those programs.
Okay.
To grow them in number and grow them in stature and grow them in impact. And so that will be my first priority. And of course, to be able to tell the story of African diasporans. Charleston and where it's built, the museum is built is such a special place. It's built on Gadsden's Wharf, where over 200,000 West Africans came in on Charleston Harbor and at Gadsden's Wharf. We even built the museum on 16 ballasts so that we could leave the ground sacred that the slaves came in on. And it's a very special place to be. It's a special place to visit, and it's an even more special place to work. If you ever get a chance and you're in the Charleston area, please make sure you stop by there. It will change your life and your perspective to see it constituted and constructed right on the wharf where slaves came in. We even have a tribute pool back there where water comes up a couple times a day, and there are silhouettes of dead African bodies underneath those tides to simulate the Africans that did not finish the voyage, but were found in the bottom of the Atlantic as the voyage was making its way to Charleston. And so it's a life-changing experience, and I recommend to anyone, black, white, red, brown, green, yellow, if you are looking for not only information but inspiration on the African diaspora quest for full human emancipation, I can't think of a better place to be than at the International African American Museum in Charleston. It is indeed a special place, and to be working there at this stage, this infant stage of development, is an honor and privilege.
Okay, and also it's not. So it sounds like it's not a departure from what you do. It's an add-on. It allows you to express your views as you have engaged in liberation theology in a different kind of way. And I guess the wonderful piece about it is that sometimes it can also be visual. So that's awesome, man. That's awesome. Congratulations. Happy for you, and going to continue to look to get you back this way, Doc. In fact, I think we had a discussion, and we have at least 2 more as we move into the future. Is that right?
We do.
All right.
Looking forward to coming. We talked about that last night, and I'm going to hold you to it, Brother Brooks.
Wow.
I might be in Austin.
All right. Well, we will get you back, and one, simply because, as I say always, Zoom is not my favorite mode of sharing. So look forward to that. As we engage this evening, we want to dig a little deeper into liberation theology, the significance of the field as a whole, and the relevance for us today. So just to start us off, we did this, the actual taping several months ago. The podcast aired within the last month and a half, as we have dropped season 2. So can you take a moment and just define again for us liberation theology?
Well, liberation theology is a movement that started formally in the academy, in academia, in the 1960s, at the height of the Black Power and civil rights movements in America, and of course the push for full human emancipation, particularly in Latin America and Asian America, and Asia as well. And it maintains that the gospel of Jesus Christ is fundamentally a gospel of liberation. And it's important because liberation theologies emerge in a context of human oppression, whether it is Latin America, whether it's the United States, whether it is Asia, whether it is the Isles, the Caribbean, the Pacific. And it seeks to identify with oppressed communities in many ways, like God through Moses identified with the Israelites in the Exodus narrative in the Bible. And it maintains, and this is particularly crucial, it maintains that when God acts in history, God acts consistently in history on the side of the oppressed, not on the side of the colonizer. And that is important because I'm sure it's going to come out in our discussion later, is that in each one of these contexts, whether it was in South Africa, whether it was in Latin America, whether it was even with Hinduism and the caste system in India, and of course the African diasporic context here in America, there's always been a prevailing public theology that sought to equate the goals of divine agency with colonialism, and not with the opposite of that, which is liberation. And so liberation theology then became a rallying force that allowed the oppressed to engage their condition, not as a people alien to divine will, but as a people who were engaged in a process of trying to bring liberation to themselves that was commensurate with divine will. And so in that sense, liberation theology became an effective and, in my judgment, a more appropriate alternative when we look at the expanse of biblical revelation and we see the consistency of God coming down in oppressed context for the oppressed and not for the perpetuation of colonialism. And so this becomes very important because it becomes a source of hope, not only from an existential historical standpoint, but it also becomes a source of hope from the encounter with God's self for oppressed people as it seeks to liberate itself from colonialism.
Okay, so you went to the colony, so you went back quite a ways, right? But as such, what we're understanding, I think what I'm hearing is God is there for the oppressed, and not just, I'm going to add, not just black oppressed, right? But all oppressed.
Yes. That it emerges, liberation theology emerges in an oppressed context.
Right. But specifically, there is that theology that does speak to the plight of a black people. And I love it as you talked about divine will. So often, sometimes the confusion is that we don't see ourselves in the Bible, and I don't want to jump ahead. We don't see ourselves in the Bible, and sometimes that challenges us to see the divine nature of God within us and operating in our lives, right? And so how do you channel that in a kind of way that says God is with you, God cares for you, caters to you, and you are a special concern of His? Is that kind of, okay.
Yeah, well, not only that God cares for you, but the restlessness with your oppressive condition, which I bring out more in my latest book than the one we're going to talk about tonight, that the restlessness that any oppressed people have with their oppressed condition is not their own strivings, that this restlessness that they have, this dissatisfaction that they have with their oppressed condition is divinely engineered. It is not just socially and historically engineered. So in that sense, we're maintaining not only that God intervenes on behalf of the oppressed, but that God energizes the oppressed base as God struggles with them to affirm their humanity in an oppressive context. And so God is busy being active, God's self, as well as infusing oppressed communities with the insatiable desire to be free.
Okay. I hear that the God creates, in my words, God creates a stirring that moves us towards liberation. And I might be going ahead a little bit, and doing those things that will help us attain that liberation. Activism, kinds of things. Okay. You put all that in a book. And the book is White Religion, Black Humanity. Now, all of your books, I'm familiar with Cone, and I've read Cone. So as I looked at Singleton, Cone was okay, but at the same time, what grabbed my attention was what the brother talking about when he talks about white religion and black humanity. So, one question, two parts. Why this book? Why this book? We talk about liberation theology, and as we go through, we will see more of how you deal with it. But why this book that talks about oppressed black folk, that talks about the divine nature and how it's manifested in black folk, and how we get to the point of accepting this Christian faith that we wholeheartedly embrace, right? And you do it in an interesting kind of way. So why this book? And then why the title? White Religion and Black Humanity.
Well, pursuant to what I said in the previous response, this book is my second book.
Okay.
And generally with theologians, usually their first book is their dissertation. It's a suited up presentation of their dissertation, and that was the case with me as well, no different.
Okay.
My first book, Black Theology and Ideology, dealt mainly with the theological methods of James Cone and Juan Luis Segundo, and that I combined those methods with James Cone's Black Theology of Liberation and Juan Luis Segundo, Latin American theologian's Liberation of Theology, which was his magnum opus, or the book for which he was most famous. And Segundo argued in that book that before theology could become a liberating force for oppressed people, it must itself be first liberated from centuries of mistreatment in the justification of colonial context, rather than establishing the liberation motif as the cornerstone of Christian theology. And so, as I move into my second book, this is my signature book. This is the book that, if not my magnum opus or the one in which you're most well known for, it was my introduction to the world, the theological world, the historical world, the Black community, the church community, as to what Harry Singleton was going to be principally about theologically.
Okay.
And so in merging these two methods, which still serve really as the cornerstone of the way I funnel theological assertions for their authenticity or lack thereof, I decided to examine phenomenologically and historically the reality of Black humanity. What is meant by Black humanity? And why is Black humanity such an important issue in particularly this context in American life? And of course, once we recognize that colonial life in America began with the enslavement of Black people for cheap labor, that it began what I call not just a racial struggle for freedom, but a theological struggle for God. And so I wanted to show the significance of Black humanity that became the point of origin of this tug of war theologically that would begin between white religious leaders and their treatment of Black humanity. And then as we began to develop a Black prophetic radical tradition, Black leaders and their theological understanding of Black humanity. So the common denominator in colonial life in America has been Black humanity. What do we make of it? White Christian leaders trying to engage in an approach to Christian theology that debased Black humanity so that they might be better exploited for cheap labor. The Black prophetic tradition is going to theologize in such a way about Black humanity that this is not what they were made for by God, but that they were made to share the resources of the earth and be free human beings as God created them from creation itself. And so Black humanity for me was central in establishing my theological method. And so I wanted to show in this book, my signature statement, how white Christian values shape Black humanity and form the basis by which not only Black people had to respond pragmatically, but how Black people had to respond theologically to centuries of being taught this debased understanding of their humanity, not just in the name of white folk, but in the name of God. And of course, the corollary to that is the establishment of white humanity as being superior. And so you can't establish a superior humanity for yourself unless you find another people to claim as inferior. And so in that sense, I wanted to show how this relationship became this, proverbial Gordian knot for not only black people personally, but for black thinkers as we try to affirm our humanity in a society that has been saying from 1619 that we're not human beings, or if we are, we're not human beings on the level of white people. Okay. That had to be dealt with for me, not only socially, economically, and politically, not only sociologically and economically, but it also had to be dealt with theologically as well, precisely because white Christian values debase black humanity as a standard and normative way of viewing black humanity and viewing it in the name of God. And in doing so, it created a tremendous struggle theologically with slaves relative to how they intuited their humanity over and against what they heard about their humanity every week. And so I wanted to put these two phenomena in relationship to show how they form the cornerstone of an emergent black theology that began in plantation life, but became formally expressed in the 1960s. So it is with these two phenomena of white religion, particularly white religious values relative to black humanity, and the phenomenon of black humanity itself, that guided me in this particular book.
Okay, all right, and hoping, because we'd love to as we talk and dig in a little deeper in a few minutes, we'd love to look deeper into well, I'm going to phrase it for you in a few seconds. Let's for a moment. You have an interesting cover with a black face. I guess I need, and the cross. What is it about the cover of this design? What's up with that?
Well, you see the silhouette of a black head with a cross seared into it. And I was inspired by this image in terms of what I was trying to establish with this work, to show the depths in which white Christian values had been ingrained in the minds of black people, either to constantly reject them, to accept them, or as a constantly internal struggle, that we cannot get around defining who we are as human beings without dealing with white Christian understandings of our enslavement being divinely engineered and divinely ordained. It's not something that was done according to them as a mean-spirited activity just to exploit cheap labor, but that they were actually guided and inspired by the hand of God's self to enslave Africans, to expose them to civilization, a civilization that they would not have gotten in Africa because Africa was considered the dark continent. And so you're dealing with an erroneous historical presupposition, and you're also dealing with an absolutely porous and sophomoric understanding of Christian faith in the process of devaluing a group of human beings because they have a darker skin pigmentation than you. And so my inspiration for this image came from a book that had a tremendous impact on me. And it's a classic in black literature. It's called The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter Woodson. One of my favorite reads. And of course, if you can recall the cover of that book, there was the image of a woman with a band tied around her head with a lock on it. And so with this work and being inspired by Woodson, I don't think that Woodson in that work went far enough in talking about the theological miseducation of the Negro.
Okay.
And so in many ways, this book is my way of examining and exploring the theological miseducation of the Negro or of black people, where I could devote an entire work and develop it beyond where Woodson did in Miseducation of the Negro. And so I drew my inspiration not only relative to the content from the Miseducation of the Negro of this book, but also the image of the miseducation of the Negro. world as well.
Okay, and that's quite interesting, because I will agree, and especially after your read, also followed your book with starting from the beginning. Forget the exact title, by Ibram Kendi, not a theologian, historian, and dealing in the area of racism and racist thoughts. So understanding that is a place that we must needs go. And I like to kind of kick it off, and probably, if we can sort of some degree separate them out, and at some point it's going to be kind of hard, right? When we talk about what folk do to others, it's sort of hard to pull them apart, but let's see what we can do. I want to kind of start, because when I read the book, all right, and a disagreement here, but I would like to at least begin to get at what I saw as Jesus the Christ, presented as a white supremacist. Okay, I went back to look, right, and I looked all day, and I got caught up on the last couple of chapters, because of that we want to look at how next steps. How can we move? But the closest that I could come is when you say every attempt was made by white clergy and theologians to equate white supremacy with the will of God. This was the case either in shameless intentionality, God as white supremacist, or ultimate benevolence, God as sovereign Lord. The selling point, of course, was that the white races' possession of social, economic, and political power meant that God had intentionally ordained that placement, and that placement being, how about not just slave, but the dehumanization. All right, because when we get past slavery, we still see black folk being dehumanized, right? So the dehumanization of black folk, and that God had ordained that by virtue of God's own whiteness. So you present to me. Now, you didn't use those words. I kind of said that you used those exact words, and we went, talked about that. But in either case, there is that sense that there was from someplace, somewhere, a message relating that was being related to people about who God was and God's intentions. And what I just read is that message was wrapped up in the fact of somehow God was made white. Therefore, Jesus, the Christ, right? Father, Son, Jesus, and not just white, but white supremacist, right? And that he ordained the state in which black folk through the years. And we can even go back to pre-colonial periods, right?
Yes.
Or ordained to be dehumanized, to be mistreated, to be beat, to be worked to death and not paid, right?
For their salvation.
For their salvation. Can we sort of start there? It was interesting because I was reading, and it makes you think. When I picked up the second book by another author and saw some of the same things being said, it's like, okay, let's really think about this. But can we start there in terms of Jesus, and you correct me, but Jesus as white supremacist?
Well, as you did note just now, I draw on two presentations of Jesus by white Christian leadership to not only their people, but especially slaves. That is, as Jesus as a avowed white supremacist, and Jesus as sovereign Lord. Those are two typologies of how Jesus had been presented, particularly as we move into the mid-18th and up into the 19th century. We start seeing the proliferation of white images of Jesus. Now, the reason for this is always twofold, and it's no different here. Christianity is the only religion that maintains that God came to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that God was incarnate. That's what makes us, proud to be Christian.
Right.
This distinction, maybe too much, sometimes to a fault, as we move to Christian superiority theories as well. But the intention with white Christian leaders was simple. If we can make Jesus white, then in our attempt to sell black people on their inferiority, that if we by imaging Jesus white, we are also saying that God's incarnation in Jesus was to incarnate God's self as a white man. This served two purposes. Number one, of course, to legitimate whiteness, skin color, as a superior manifestation of being human, and to establish darker skin as an inferior way of being human. In doing so, it would enable whites to better socially control slaves by then selling them on the fact that this inferior-superior relationship between the races is the linchpin that should legitimate in the slave mind the authenticity of slavery itself. Not just as a historical institution, but as a divine institution. And so in this sense, in the first typology, God as a vowed white supremacist, held by many white Christian leaders, was that God ordained racial superiority of whiteness and the racial inferiority of blackness. And that in light of that, God ordained whites to make the major decisions on the social, economic, and political dispensation of justice in the life of not only the nation, but the world, but particularly the nation. And so if Jesus was white, and if God became Jesus, and Jesus said, when you see me, you see the Father, then it must necessarily by inference mean that God is white as well. So if you are black, and you are in a state of bondage, and you're being sold that God is white, then it makes logical racist sense, as I call it, for you to more thoroughly internalize your inferiority because you're not white. So rather than looking at the Christian theological spectrum through the lens of one common humanity, the theological breach is made when white Christian ministers and theologians and slaveholders decided to make a distinction between quality of humanity in God's eyes based on skin pigmentation, which of course is the meaning of racism. And so in that sense, God is made an avowed white supremacist in the sense that God identifies with and condones the goals of white men on earth in their attempt to build an economic empire for themselves, and more particularly to build it on the free slave labor in the backs of non-white people, namely black slaves from Africa. The other typology, God as sovereign Lord, does not list God as a white supremacist. And this was the other approach that some white Christian leaders took. That was that Jesus is white, and God also by inference is white, but there is no condoning of slavery in this typology. That in this particular typology, God is unconcerned about human suffering. Now, this is a very important point, and probably has been just as virulent post-slavery. then God is about white supremacy. Because then it creates a theological dilemma on the part of slaves that if we have been enslaved for this long, then maybe God does not care about our suffering. At the same time, the theological rebuke once again is that biblical revelation shows us that God is concerned about human relationships and human history. In fact, the incarnation itself is a manifestation that God is concerned not only about the human plight, but he's concerned about the plight of people who are exploited, who are marginalized, and who don't have the power to fight like they should to affirm their humanity. That is also running consistent through biblical revelation. So it was very important for white Christian leaders to establish that we are dealing with a God, even of Jesus Christ, even of biblical revelation, that is either a condoner of white supremacy or is someone who is unconcerned about what's happening to black people on earth as an enslaved people. Both of them are profound theological breaches of understanding biblical revelation to me, but yet at the same time became two selling points for understanding not only the reality of God and divine will, but the meaning of the incarnation itself.
Okay. And was there not more to that? And I'd say more to it, because that was also some, I'm going to use the word brainwashing, right? That had to be done to white folk, right? As you look at those two sides, what was important, as I read some of your book, and I apologize, but I think some of that the historical pieces from Kendi, as I read from, even as we look at pre-colonial coming into the Americas, economic situations, right? That was how we're going to get money, and at the same time have not cheap labor but free labor. But that there were also those white folks who didn't believe in it, but at the same time they didn't want to lose their free labor. Is that right? So they also had to be convinced of the supremacy of their own whiteness.
Right.
And I think that was
as important as the conditioning of slave minds as well. Just as important. If, in some cases, some would argue more important.
Yeah, because that allowed for the ill treatment. Is that right? And at the same time, you're ordained.
Yes.
That's God's will for you.
Yes.
But at the same time, that was also that piece. That's good. After death, you'll get your reward on the other side. So
Yes.
it's okay to beat you right now. It's okay to make you work for nothing right now. You do what I say do, and you be obedient to me, and you'll get your reward in heaven.
Let's say in the church right now, in just about every black church, I have heard a minister say that earth has no sorrow, that heaven can't heal.
Okay.
That moniker was developed in slavery to convince slaves that they were in fact engaged in obedient relationship with God by acquiescing to the slavocracy, with their reward being after death, that they would make it into heaven and would be a recipient of eternal life. In light of them being a good slave. And of course it unpacks another conversation about philosophically and historically and socially what goodness meant.
Yeah.
What goodness still means for black people interacting with white people and socially controlling and regulating the behavior of black people.
Okay. So as
but to your point, let me also add this. It was also, as you said, equally important to sell whites on their superior position in this process. And the sell went very well, that your superior position has been given you by God out of God's goodness, and that you should do what is necessary to maintain it. That's why, black people have always wondered why white people are so resistant to black progress. The reason why they are resistant to black progress, first and foremost, is because of what they have been taught religiously about their superior place in society. This is why they have trouble when a gain by African Americans is seen as a setback to them. But when we go and take a look at the Civil War itself, they prayed to what they understood the God of Jesus Christ. Their ministers, their lay people, their deacons, their assistant ministers, that they were going to be victorious in the Civil War. Even though they had less ammunition, less people, that they were going to be victorious, namely because God had ordained black enslavement and their superior position in society. And so despite, in fact, they were going to be the miracle. They were going to be the David and the Goliath. They were going to be, they actually styled themselves as David going into the Civil War to go up against this mighty Union Goliath and, of course, the federal government, namely because after generation up to the mid-19th century, they had now been thoroughly convinced that their place in society was ordained of God and that they were ready to not only fight, but to die for it. The Civil War, more so than any war in American history, has given us the most casualties. It has given us 639,000 casualties. And that is more than any other theater of war in American history. And what was that war about? That war was about whether the states that were going to be incorporated moving west of the eastern seaboard beyond the 13 colonies were either going to be slave states or whether they were going to be free states. And the Confederacy fought in the name of God to maintain their Confederacy and to create the other states moving in the Western territories as slave states because God had revealed to them.
And the challenge is not also their challenge. And you talk about the slave states, I think maybe. We even see it filtering in today even. The casualty was not just on the battlefield, or the world is the battlefield, right? Because in most countries around the world, those who have a darker hue, right? And we are around the world. Those who have a darker hue, almost wherever you go, are going to be those who are set aside as inferior. Looking at time, I'm going to ask, what does that do for us today as we look at Christianity, as we look at church, right? And I'm moving because our time, I think it's about 39, so we're moving here. And all of this, as we understand white supremacy as seen through the eyes of white folk, that allows themselves to see God as they see themselves, as white, that gives them the credence, that gives them the special privilege.
The legitimacy.
Right? The legitimacy. And it's okay because even in the Civil War, for those who fought for black folk, it was still that mindset because they had so well indoctrinated white folk along with black folk, right? And also because the good Christians also understood money, power, economics, right? And so even in those who fought for the freedom, for the abolishment of slavery, it was placing, quote unquote, the Negro within the spiritual realm, still where he would get his reward in heaven later. So because you're going to get your reward later in heaven, it's okay for me to mistreat you here. All right? Even those physically, mentally, in every other, and I'm going to say spiritually abusive.
Yes.
When you when you regulate one's place spiritually in the heavenly realm and not understanding the activity of God as he moves right in the earthly realm. And I think you say relationships matter, right? And for those white folks, the relationship mattered. No. What mattered was, and for those who were pious and wanted to do it right, yes, and were feeling guilty, and sometimes those who were really powerful and who were really pushing hard the white supremacist view, even of Jesus, okay, yes, even of Jesus, and that Jesus says it's okay, so you must abide with it because it's the word of God. Right? You're going to hell if you don't. So there is still some negative kinds of things going on that are still carried out today. White superiority is legitimized. As I read your book, and again, it was impacted as I read Kendi, looking from the historical perspective. They begin that process in the pre-colonial period, right? With the first time Europeans saw somebody black. Yeah. Whoa!
Yeah, they're different from us.
They're different from us. Difference becomes a catalyst for engaging in the racial thoughts and separating and allowing saying that somebody here has to be superior. It's gonna be me because I'm white and I'm like God, right? And God speaks to you, and God's telling you. So it's all of that, and it has come up through the centuries, right? Through the years.
Absolutely.
It's well embedded into the minds of white Christians, but it's also embedded still in the minds of black Christians.
Absolutely.
Is that right? And I want to move to that in piece 9 and 10, and I want to do it. You had some of your chapters. I appreciate it. You had other authors, and you started chapter 9 with a quote, James Baldwin. I had one of yours that you had, Frederick Douglass. But as we look at how do we, because my question, and before I read, what does that say about Christianity as we practice it today?
It says that Christianity is a farce the way we practice it today.
Okay, and can I?
Here I'm quoting my father, actually, who pastored for 42 years. He used to say that all the time. So shout out to my father, God rest his soul. It is a farce, namely done because it continues to frown on and ostracize prophetic voices that speak to the hurt and suffering and perpetuation of oppressive relationships as someone who's out of step with the real gospel or with the Christian gospel, which has become far more evangelical in the sense that it's more concerned about the religious individual. It is more concerned about the church as a building, in this mega church, prosperity ministry age, motivational speaker age. And again, it's concerned more about what will happen to the individual soul ultimately than what happens to communities of people in history. Those three contemporary realities guide the theology of the church. Okay. And our songs, sermons, and prayers emerge from that. Which means that, unfortunately, when you enter into liberation theology or liberation methodology, it becomes tainted it becomes branded as alien. It becomes branded as militant. It becomes branded as radical. It becomes branded in some cases as even iconoclastic. James Cone said in Black Theology of Liberation, we see black theologians must perform the iconoclastic task of smashing false images. False images, white Jesus condones slavery. False images, white God condones slavery. And so we have to smash those images as we have to begin the process of what Segundo called de-ideologizing, which is a sophisticated way of saying unlearning a lot of what we have learned. We have to keep in mind, Don, that the black church was not founded after slavery. The black church was founded during slavery, and it was founded on plantations during slavery, not to make black people free from white people, but it was done at the benevolence of white Christian ministers from white Christians, so-called white Christians, who no longer wanted to worship with black people. Before that, they had us in the buzzard roost in their churches. That's why in many southern cities you see these churches with decks in them. Namely because that's where black people sat. They didn't want to worship with black people, even with black people being up in what they call derogatorily the buzzard roost. So they conceded, and in that concession allowed black people to have their so-called independent black churches. But I ask you, how independent socially, politically, and theologically could it be, biblically could it be, if you had white ministers in the back listening to everything that was going on to make sure that the black ministers they did develop was not engaging in a language that was incendiary or that would cause insurrection. But when you are in a context of bondage, that becomes an appropriate expression of God. And so what we have done in essence, Don, is that we have made what is inappropriate theologically, condoning human mistreatment on the basis of race, we've made it appropriate. And we have condemned appropriate theological conclusions based on biblical revelations as inappropriate. That when you speak out against injustice, when you speak out against poverty, when you speak out against structural problems in society, when you speak out on 8 people who are billionaires who make more than 3.6 million people combined, that somehow you are what's wrong with America and you're what's wrong with the world, and particularly in America that calls itself a Christian nation, that becomes a farcical approach to not only daily life, but a farcical approach to Christian theology.
Okay, so what do we do? Here is what you've put in here. And I think this quote is James Baldwin. When I faced the congregation, it began to take all the strength I had. When I faced the congregation, it began to take all the strength I had not to stammer, not to curse, not to tell them to throw away their Bible and get off their knees and go home and organize, for example, a rent strike. When I watched all the children, their copper, beige, and brown faces staring up at me as I taught Sunday school, I felt that I was committing a crime in talking about the gentle Jesus and telling them to reconcile themselves to every misery on earth in order to gain the crown of eternal life. Interesting. Often what we still believe today, right? I have a relative and waiting for God to do. God's going to work it out for me. God can do anything, right? But God, but He's also equipped you. He's also endowed you. He's imbued you. So you have the ability to not just sit there, right? But to do.
You have the ability. You have the necessity, because God always works through agents. God did not go and liberate Israel from Egypt. God sent Moses. God became Jesus. God sent the prophets. So out of necessity, the movement from oppression to liberation entails a distinctive human participation through divine guidance. And so that's the only way it's going to happen. We sitting around waiting on God to touch the earth with a magic wand. It's not going to happen. But one of the reasons why we do is because we've been thoroughly indoctrinated to think that.
Through Jesus the white supremacist.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Or sovereign Lord.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to ask you this question, and hopefully it will lead us to our conclusion. Your constructive proposal. That is going to rectify a situation, that a positive piece that will help change things and turn things around. What's your constructive proposal as regards to liberation theology, as regards to the white racist Jesus? I'm gonna stop saying that, okay? But that's what kept me. That's what kept me reading your book, right?
But yeah, said, black people have been at their best when they have been in militant mode. And when I say militant, I don't mean it in a negative sense or a condescending sense, the way it's been branded. And I chose militancy intentionally because I did want to take the term militancy through the thicket of white supremacist criticism. Militancy has always helped black people advance themselves. When they have organized and when they have resolutely challenged structural injustice, particularly as it relates to racial injustice in America, particularly collectively, that's when we've been at our strength, and I think that's when America has been at its strongest. There's a sense for me in which America is only at its best when black America is at its best. And so in that sense, I am trying to sell militancy here, unashamedly, not as a derogatory disposition for black people, but as a positive and even as a salvific and redemptive disposition for black people.
So what does that look like in the black church? And I'm going to say, what does that look like in a black church? And I think some are doing it right. We had our what we call St. John's Association. All churches in the city come together, and the moderator had a wonderful message that encapsulated much of what's going on in the world, in America, as we look at the presidency of Brother Trump, as we look at the attack on all things black and non-white.
Yes.
What does that mean if we're going to move beyond following the edicts?
Right.
And I'm going to say a racist Jesus, but that racist Jesus was created by a people, by white people who had a need to be superior. Right? And that language and some of those teachings as people of color, and because we were slaves, we bought into, some carried that with them beyond slavery. Right? Some of it is still prevalent today.
Yes.
What is it that we do to begin to change the scope of things, to begin to understand I do not have to operate within the guise of a Jesus who espouses racist thoughts, a white community, right? Do we stay where we are? I know you talked about a lot here and trying to. I need to give myself more table space, right? You talk about a lot here in terms of the way that we do church often today. So can we talk about just briefly, not just how we do church, but if we're going to move forward, and you talk about the egalitarian militancy, however we do it, and if we do it under the guise of your egalitarian militancy, What does that look like? Is it possible? And can we as Black Church do it without the approval, sanctioning of those who imposed it on us in the first place? The white.
And that's the meaning of liberation theology and why it's so important. Because it does mean making a decision about your acceptance in the dominant community for favors, particularly for Black religious leadership, for favors, for prominence, for recognition, which have become important to a lot of Black pastors in the contemporary era. But dates back to slavery too, when we got days off in the field, when we, ratted out an insurrection, or when we helped, prolong white supremacy. And so, we got to make a choice for liberation, which means a choice to commit to unlearn a lot, Don, of what we have learned. The whole notion of, the religious individual, the church as a building, and otherworldliness, have to be lifted up in churches as the basis for which we expand or move away from, and begin to think about preaching not just to convert people to come to church, but preaching to change the racial landscape of America. Preaching to change the gender landscape of America. The Catholic Church still refuses to ordain women to the priesthood. Many white, Black Protestant ministers still refuse to ordain women to the priesthood. To engage in an all-out attack on poverty, of which the man we're shouting about every Sunday at church, John, Jesus, railed against most of his public ministry. That he deplored poverty more than anything else. And so in that sense, we have to change our songs, sermons, and prayers so that they reflect more of our now willingness theologically to take on these issues as the true church of God and the true church of Jesus, but also too as theologians. I mean, we have to write more, we have to find greater venues with which to speak, and to make sure that we are holding the church and society accountable relative to its so-called Christian virtue and its so-called Christian connection, to make sure that we are not continually using Christianity as a pretext to perpetuate a political, social, economic reality that favors a few to the detriment of many. And that is exactly what is happening today. And so one could make the case now, which I will, that liberation theology is needed just as much in 2025 as it was needed in 1965.
Okay. And I'm going to add to that, maybe because a whole lot of folk don't see it yet.
Excuse me?
Because it's been an indoctrination that has been a part of society for so long, some folk can't even see it.
Can't even see it.
Yeah.
And yet and that's what the challenge is, because we have been doing it this way for so long, that when someone comes along and say, hey, let's take a look at it and depart from faith by looking at it this way, they are automatically programmed to brand it as being iconoclastic, or to brand it as being treasonous, or to brand it as being heretical. And so in that sense, you make up in your mind, as my mentor Jacqueline Grant told me, that in this society they make what's up look down and what's down look up. So if you are a woman challenging sexism, you're going to be calling sexism reversed. If you are a Black person challenging racism, you're going to be called a racist in reverse. And so there is, unfortunately, Don, a tinge of sincerity in the people who brand people who speak out against racism as racist and sexist themselves. Namely because, as you said, they are not able to see how they have been indoctrinated to think the way they have, which is why more and more analysis, more and more literary contributions, and more public discourse is needed so that they can begin to see, so that the light can come on, as we talked about in our last conversation, so that they can have that aha moment and begin to see the reality of the gospel and it's diametric opposite in the way that we are living.
I saw in your writing as we get to the 10th to chapter 10, maybe something that might be helpful. You talk about hence a new Christian paradigm must emerge in America that frees us from obsessing about rituals and piety and pushes us into the realm of contributory efforts to the eradication of human oppression. The grace that God gives in Jesus Christ must no longer be confined to the individual soul after death, but to the opportunity that God gives us with our lives to render a sacrifice in the struggle for full human emancipation. And you use two terms by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Is the second, perhaps, that which we need to begin to teach, that we can begin to move our people, to the point of not only worshiping and serving to get to heaven, but to make a difference. And the two terms were meaning and belonging, which so often we say folk today, well, what needs to happen? Folk are looking for a place to belong. Folk are looking for meaning in their lives, which is true, right? And that's important. But then the second term that is used is the church of sacrifice for meaning and belonging. So there's different phrasing. Means about the church of sacrifice for meaning and belonging, or the church of meaning and belonging alone.
Yeah.
Can you say something?
Bonhoeffer makes that distinction, and of course I appropriate it here. That from a phenomenological standpoint, that meaning and belonging become the basis by which we join a Christian community. And we join it in such a way that we are interdependent on each other for refuge and for camaraderie and for community. But for Bonhoeffer, the gospel itself pushes us beyond meaning and belonging to sacrifice itself.
Okay.
And of course, we see that exemplified in his life. He could have stayed in America, teaching at Union Theological Seminary in the early 30s, but decides to go back to Germany and challenge Hitler.
Okay.
And what he was doing to Jews in Germany. But we also see that sacrifice done, and this is important, and this is the way also the incarnation itself has been distorted. We see the sacrifice that I speak of and that Bonhoeffer speaks of in God self. Because God becomes Jesus to take on human qualities, to struggle with human beings, to realize human emancipation, and even goes to the cross and dies for it. And we have misinterpreted the Christ event itself and the passion of Jesus as a sacrifice that paid for our sins so that we don't have to do it in our time. That's bad theology.
So why is that bad theology?
About black and white churches. The reality is that the Christ event is not a paradigm. The Christ event, what Jesus was trying to tell us and God was trying to tell us through Jesus, is that the Christ event is a blueprint. It is a blueprint for sacrifice in the absence of God and Jesus, in the absence of Jesus' physical presence on earth. That's why it was important for Jesus to make disciples. Jesus was sending a message to the world that I want God's will to reign even as we move through successive generations. And so the sacrifice was not supposed to be understood as a one-time event, but it's supposed to be understood as a paradigm. But it is convenient to conceive of it as a one-time event so we can go to church on Sunday and say, I'm glad Jesus got the nails bammed in his hand and his feet, and I'm so glad that I don't have to do it. That is not a proper understanding of the incarnation, but it is a self-serving interpretation of the incarnation designed to produce confessing Christians and not designed to produce liberators for God. So
could it be said that on some levels, and really could it be said that maybe as we've moved through the years, find ourselves in 2025, and even before that, really, that we have bought into the white supremacist ideology, theology, to the point, because our understanding, it was about economics, right? It was about how do I keep the money coming? It's looking good. I can't go do the fields. We got to get these black folk come out here and do this. We tried Indians, and then no one else seemed to be able to really hang in there. They didn't work. We tried some other white folk and indentured servants, and that didn't work. But when we got to the black folk, right? But at the same time, as we've moved through the years, is it possible that we have gotten caught up in some of that, and while we understand we don't like the racist dimensions of it, but we do like power, we do like money, and so we are blinded maybe because like was that Phyllis Wheatley, I'm not free until all my people are free. That the struggle is still very real. That somewhere we've got to dismantle some of the theologies that we've learned, that we've got to come into a new place of being. For you, it's egalitarian militancy in the confines of the spiritual religious, and we've got to try to move there, understanding, even in this day and age, right? I'm glad that I guess you all have control over your museum, right? Because they're taking stuff out of the African American Museum in D.C., right?
In D.C.
And other kinds of things. You used the word too, that a holy rage. Use the phrase. What do you say? If we indeed engage, we will instead see a church engaged in a holy rage concerning human exploitation in all forms, and makes humanity's inhumanity to humanity.
Absolutely.
The central reason for its existence. That even within confines of the black church, we're seeing that superiority complex being exhibited. That even in the black and maybe true, maybe not so true. I'm thinking of some of the podcasts and that I've seen. The casting of judgment, the tearing of folk, anything but love, and somewhere on some levels, good intentions, I think, but are demeaning and sometimes in an inhumane way. And all I can think of lessons that we have learned
Absolutely.
from our white supremacist Christian
Right.
brothers and sisters. And we have picked it up and we carry the mantle and we mistreat ourselves and we do a better job of it than white folk do. Sometimes.
There is no cause for collective racial justice because we bought into the notion that nothing is systemic anymore. Everyone has the same chance individually to
Oh, and that's really crazy now, right?
Which couldn't be further from the truth. But you would have to think that there would be a reasonable number of black people who, after centuries of harsh oppression, acute oppression, would say, hey, let me look at what the white boys do and copy them. In fact, some of my friends have said that. And so in that sense, there are black people who have internalized white values because they see no other game in town. And so that also becomes a challenge in the process of the full emancipation of a people, because they are willing to do anything, and I mean anything, in order to live a non-threatening life. And the way to do that in America as a black person is to live your life in favor of white people, to live your life in such a way that white people find it favorable, particularly important white people or wealthy white people. And so in that sense, that's always been the challenge and continues to be the challenge today, even with the driving overseer of slavery, who completely sold out to black people never being free and decided to curry favor with the slave master by being the overseer on the plantation. So we see this divide and conquer, and we always see these enticements from white men intentionally to black men and some black women if they would sell out the larger struggle of their people. We've seen it in, as an overseer during the plantation and during slavery, and we see it now in the form of a CEO job or assistant CEO job with 6 figures or maybe even 7 figures these days. If you want to keep black folk, shut up, give a job. You want to keep black folks shut up, make it worth their while. And so because we have lived several generations of acute poverty, and maybe that particular black person grew up in an extremely impoverished situation, they jump at the chance to do it and sell the larger struggle of their people down the drain. And so that has also been a part and parcel of the struggle for full human emancipation for black people. It is the recognition that black people are willing to curry favor with the white system that's killing the masses of our people for their own individual aggrandizement.
Okay, and I'll say all white folk ain't doing it. In liberation theology, there is hope. In the confines of liberation theology, there is hope. What is that hope? Your last words. We said 12:15. What are the 9? Hour and 15, the latest, and we almost there. In liberation theology, there is hope. Where's the hope? How do we move on that hope? And what do we do to ensure that our children, and for me, I'm going to say not just my niece and nephews, but at this point, my great nieces and nephews, right? The oldest 23, the youngest 12. My great nieces and nephews who are coming up, sometimes I fear for what it might be like when I think about where we are. So, what is it that, under the guise of liberation theology, that Black church can do to raise the hope and to move us forward in the spirit of a risen Christ? There was some place, and I forget who it was. I think you, Frederick Douglass, you quoted him. The religion of the land.
Yes.
I think that's what he said. The religion of the land and the religion of Jesus the Christ. And too often we find ourselves following the religion of the land in reality, as opposed to the religion of Jesus the Christ. In that hope, where's the hope, and how do we, in that hope, move a people to, and that's not just a black, that's all people, because the world gets better when we all follow the religion of Jesus the Christ and not the religion of the land. How do we move folk to do that?
Well, the hope is in the liberation motif itself. If we are the Christians we confess we are, then the hope is in God's promise that God would never leave us nor forsake us. And not only never leave us or forsake us, but parlay that into a liberation motif means that God will struggle with us to achieve liberation, and it will be achieved. The hope lies in the Christ event itself, that the phenomenon of liberation itself can never be killed. Only the vessel of liberation and generation. So whether it's Bonhoeffer, whether it's King, whether it's Douglass, whether it's Malcolm, whether it's Harry Singleton, whether it's Don Brewington, we're going to leave here one day physically. But what the Christ event showed us is that the principle of God's desire for human liberation for all people can never be killed by even the most ruthless country in the history of the world. Whether that's ancient Greek Rome, whether that's the United States, whether that was South Africa, whether that was India, it can never be destroyed. The liberating principle will always exist, and the world is ignorant in trying to kill people, thinking it can kill the liberation motif and subsequently the hope. It can't. It will keep coming, not because these people are incendiary, but because God desires that for the human family. And if we are the confessing Christians we claim ourselves to be, the Bible ends with the New Jerusalem. And John the Revelator said, I looked up and saw a New Jerusalem come down into human history. Not away to heaven, but come down in human history. History then is the venue by which God's liberation is realized. And if we are confessing Christians, I can't think of any greater hope than a liberation motif that can never be killed by even the most ruthless progenitors of oppression in this world.
That's following. Thank you for your willingness to come and share with us a second time so soon. Appreciate it. A wonderful discussion, a discussion that I think is important, is necessary as we as a people, specifically a black people, but we as a people share the gospel and share because something happened today and it was interesting, right? Folk have good hearts. Folk had good hearts. Some of the white folk, right? When they were being white racist supremacists, right? And some really trying hard not to do that. But when you can sanction my mistreatment of you for economic gain and say you're gonna get your reward in heaven when you die, that's a problem. It's
a huge problem.
That's a problem. But those thoughts exist, and sometimes from good-hearted people. I sit on the consultation committee for a program, CPE program, and there was a interview today that I sat on. Kid, it's a new program, and the young brother was white, and great young man, right? Walked up and met him as I arrived. A great conversation, right? As we began to talk, and one question was and I asked the question, your personal history. How will it inform who you are as a chaplain and as a CPE educator? It's an educator program, so. And he didn't know how to answer because he wanted to talk specifically to me, right? And he got kind of lost and entangled. And some of it, it's from middle Georgia, and a wonderful opportunity to say I've come from places where I understand racism, where I understand, and those things as we engage the other. I understand what it means to engage with respect, with dignity. But he couldn't go there. He told me a whole bunch of stories. He told me a story about finding slave names when he went back home after his parents' death. And now, I'm really not interested in your slave that your grandpappy had. Nice story, but not one that I want to hear. And the difficulty of moving. As he finished, I gave some offerings, right? Understanding that as you enter a room, as you're teaching folk to be chaplains, and especially those of color, can you be sensitive to where they are? Can you recognize them for who they are? Because he talked about people being just like me and people that, but I'm not like you. How will you relate to me? Right? And we don't give that thought sometimes. Great young man, good heart, but just has not yet untangled that. Yeah, and then he heard the voice. He heard what I had to say. But as I look at a people, so many who have good hearts, well-intended, but are still set in the theology of white supremacy.
Absolutely.
And therein lies.
Realize that they are, as you stated.
And therein lies the situation. Something that's needed, a great conversation. I hope those who tune in will find it engaging, exciting, and would want to go out and buy White Religion and Black Humanity. This is one that we've talked about this evening, as well as Forever in Thy Path the God of Black liberation. We didn't get to this, but I sort of knew we wouldn't, because, man, you know what? We could really be here another hour dealing with white religion and Black humanity. But do go out and purchase these books. They're really good reading, and I really found interesting White Humanity, Black Religion. Take a read. It's a good book. It's enlightening, and it'll help us understand better why we do church the way we do church oftentimes, and what we perhaps can do or need to do to move beyond, right? So thank you for being here today. Thank you for sharing with us, followers, listeners, viewers. Thank you for tuning in and spending time with us. My prayer is that something has been said on this evening that has caused you to pause and wonder, what's up with that? Great conversation. Hope you enjoyed it. And we look forward to seeing you on the next time as we engage in conversation and ask questions. What's up with that? Until then, be blessed.